All right, so welcome to Reading Tolkien podcast. We're a new podcast intended to kind of read through Tolkien's work carefully and with, I suppose, a thematic and literary focus. And as we sort of go through today's inaugural episode, I'll explain a bit about what sort of I envisage for the podcast. But first, I'll introduce the co-host, Razib. So, hello, Razib. How are you?
Hey, how's it going, man? I'm really excited to talk about Tolkien and be an unashamed nerd of Middle Earth.
Yes, that's awesome. Yeah, me too. It's a bit of an experiment, but it's been a while. Or I've been wanting to do a podcast, I guess, for a while on Tolkien and sort of perhaps not just Tolkien, but maybe some related things. And I'm sure we'll get into that. I know you love George R. R. Martin, so or at least I know you've read his books. Yeah.
Yes, I do. We can get into that. I definitely I've been reading George R. R. Martin since January of 1999. So
Right.
That's actually a substantial portion of my life now. It's basically my whole adult life. So I have actually changed my views somewhat. And if you want to get into that, we can get into that later.
Sure. Just one quick question before I go any further. Do you think he'll actually release the next book?
I think for the next book, I give it a 50-50 shot, but I don't think he will complete it. I don't, because he has 2 books to go.
Interesting.
And
okay. Yeah.
He's already like, it was spring of 2011 that he came out with the last book. So we're getting 9.5 years out now.
Yeah, that's amazing, isn't it? My God, I remember going to buy the last book, but yeah, gosh, that's so long ago now. I was just starting university.
It's 2011. It's a decade ago. I mean, the world was very different.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, anyway, as you say, we can get into that, and I'm sure we'll talk about Martin quite a bit as that comes up, and perhaps other authors as well who we might want to sort of compare and contrast to Tolkien. So I suppose before we launch into what we want to discuss in this first episode, which will just be a sort of a casual conversation, perhaps we'll talk about Lord of the Rings a bit and also the upcoming sort of TV show, which no doubt we will talk about as that is released and as the news comes out about that. Although I should say at the time of recording, we don't have a lot of news, so there's not much to go on, unfortunately. But there has been some recent, controversy, which we'll talk about. But before we do that, I just wanted to outline, I suppose, my own vision of the podcast, if you like, which sounds very pretentious, but anyway. So, as I said, I suppose I had been wanting to do a podcast for a while, just in part because I know this show is coming up, and also because there are a lot of other Tolkien podcasts out there now, and there are more and more that are released all the time. And in general, what they seem to do, and this is not a criticism per se, but they take one of the books and then read through chapter by chapter. And this is very good, but I noticed more or less everyone is doing this, and so I wanted to sort of do a podcast which wouldn't do that. Which is revolutionary, but just to approach Tolkien, I suppose, in a different way. So I thought a sort of a thematic approach might be interesting. So each episode we might have a reading of some text, if Tolkien's not necessarily in like chronological order or anything, and then perhaps also some sort of secondary text, like an article or something like that, which sheds light on the text. And of course, Tolkien's more than just Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit. So I wanted to start with a different kind of text, and not one of those more famous ones, although no doubt we will get to those. So I just wanted to ask, Razib, what have you read of Tolkien's work up to this point?
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely not a completist, but I'm also not like someone who's just read, the trilogy along with The Hobbit. I have read. This is back in my dorky teen years. I have read Unfinished Tales. I have read the Silmarillion. I have read a few other anthologies that Christopher Tolkien put together. So Christopher Tolkien is the late son of J.R.R. Tolkien, and he put out this series, The History of Middle Earth. There's all of this work based on his father's notes and his unfinished manuscripts. And so I did read some of that. This is back in the 1990s, and so it wasn't all entirely available, and it wasn't all accessible. It's totally different now. So, there are these websites like Tolkien Gateway, and Men of the West is a YouTube show that I occasionally listen to, because they just shed light on this whole voluminous literature, this whole imagination that came out of this one guy's mind. And that's just kind of amazing to me. I'm at the stage in my life where I would not I can't make that my life, like my thing, but if I was 15, I can see that this would really, really capture me in a way that I couldn't have done it just reading Unfinished Tales or the other shorter works, the incomplete works of Tolkien that I did read. So I do have some background, but I'd say I'm definitely middle core.
I guess if we're thinking about hierarchies like that, I guess I am hardcore. Although I wouldn't call myself a completist either. I don't have every volume of every publication. The History of Middle Earth series, for example, I don't own.
Yeah.
Well, I don't have most of that actually.
But there's so many volumes of that. Sometimes I think if you're a Tolkien completist, with the rate that normal people read, you're not going to be reading anything else in your life. There's just too much.
Yeah. No, that's true. And I think those volumes are designed more or less for sort of dipping into. They're not necessarily going to be read, and they are scholarly. They are sort of assemblages of texts that are not really designed to be read through necessarily. Although I suppose you could do that, and I have heard that some people do that, but certainly I do not approach the History of Middle Earth like that, because that would take some time, and there are lots of other books. I think we're both pretty heavy readers, from judging from your blog as well. I think you're doing a reading series at the moment or something.
We're doing my blog is called Gene Expression for the listeners. I'm doing a book club where we are reading one chapter of two books right now. Not Born Yesterday. It's a cognitive science book about how humans aren't gullible by Hugo Mercier, and also Autumn in the Heavenly Kingdom by Stephen Platt, which is about the Taiping Rebellion in the 1850s. So every week, some readers and I are reading one chapter of each, but I'm also reading other things concurrently usually. I read
cool.
nonfiction history now. I'm a geneticist, so when it comes to genetics, I just tend to read the papers. I don't read the books. And then when it comes to fiction, I just, I feel like I get more out of. I could have a heart attack tomorrow. Not to be morbid, right? So, do I want to have read the latest Brandon Sanderson or? Something more just timeless in my opinion. And so I've definitely moved away. Like if George R. R. Martin came out with his next book, next week, it was published, which it's not going to be, yes, I would read it. I still haven't read the next in the Name of the King, that series. I forget the author's name now.
I don't know that one.
The King Killer series, the King Kill in the Name of the Wind. Yeah, the King Killer series, right?
Oh,
and so
yes. Okay.
he has been really, really delayed on his third book. And here's the thing: I actually bought his second book in 2012, but I refused to read it. And I was basically thinking, I don't want to get into this George R. R. Martin thing.
That's the last one to come out?
So I just was I told my brother, I was like, I'm just going to wait until the third book comes out. It's been 8 years and it still hasn't come out. And I know that it's Patrick Rothfuss, by the way, is the name, the author. Right. But and I know his agent has complained about his tardiness, even on Facebook. She deleted the post. But so there's a whole thing there. I don't know the drama. So I tend not to read that much fiction. But I've read. I think I haven't read some of the newer books that have come out on Middle Earth, they're kind of like repackaged from the Silmarillion. So I might, depending on just time and how I feel like it. But so why am I, I want to say, Ben, why I'm interested in Middle Earth and why Tolkien still speaks to
Sure.
me. He's been
Sure.
so influential in genre fiction,
Yeah.
in the fantasy genre fiction. Like Brandon Sanderson has talked about how everything is basically a Tolkien ripoff. And authors like George R. R. Martin or R. Scott Baker, they write their works in part as a counterpoint to Tolkien. So Tolkien is the reference. Like, even if you reject his framework in some way, you're starting with him. And so he really revolutionized and created this whole genre. And I think it transcends genre. The Lord of the films, Lord of the Rings films came out in the wake of 9/11, and they were very, very inspirational, and they spoke to a particular cultural moment. I mean, that's how people felt about them. Like, I was, alive and sentient in the United States at the time, and I can tell you, people said, the men of the West fighting, these dark forces, blah blah blah. It was, in hindsight, it was obviously exaggeration, and it's not like these terrorists living in a cave in Afghanistan are orcs, although orcs probably do live in caves. I don't know, but what I'm trying to say is
Yeah.
they do speak to broader themes,
Sure.
and there's this idea that serious fiction has to be about like contemporary affairs, and something like The Corrections, Jonathan Franzen, like a book about a Midwest family, and
Yeah.
I don't agree with that. There are people who are fans of genre fiction who think that genre fiction, the way it's been ghettoized, is kind of an artificial it's an artificial modern construct to like constrain it that way, partly because what were the great like mythic works of the past? Like, what is the Iliad? The Iliad is actually a lot like genre fiction, or
Yeah, for
Indian
sure. Yeah.
tradition, the Ramayana or the Mahabharata. They're basically like what we would call epic fantasy today. The story of Gilgamesh, it's
Sure.
very similar to epic fantasy. So we don't have too many like prose novels from the past where it's like psychological interiority of someone
No.
who works as an overseer on a farm in ancient Egypt. It's
No,
just
that's right.
it's like these grand themes. So that's what I think
Yeah.
Tolkien's important.
Yeah, absolutely. And perhaps the closest we have from the ancient world to sort of something approximating a realist novel, a kind of Greco-Roman novels, which do seem to have been a sort of a kind of genre, somewhat analogous to a modern realist novel. But even there, they often involved, supernatural powers. The famous one is, of course, the ass.
Yeah, the Golden
Asparagus.
Ass. Yeah,
Yeah, the golden ass. That's it. Yeah,
that's
yeah.
a pretty funny novel too.
But yeah, exactly. So even there, it's not. There's nothing quite analogous to sort of the sort of damp, dreary realism that passes for modern fiction. And I just want to say, in terms of my reading habits, I'm broadly similar, and I think 80 to 90% of what I read would be also nonfiction, history, archaeology, which is what I've studied, and my fiction reading is fairly limited to actually to American fiction from the 19th and sort of mid 20th century. So I have sort of a weird interest in American fiction, despite obviously from my accent being Australian. Um, so my sort of fiction interests are not necessarily easily. They're not going to be sort of easily prophesied, as it were. If all you knew about my reading was that I was interested in Tolkien. I've tried the fantasy genre, the sort of more recent novels. I've read all of George R. R. Martin up to now, or up to 2011, and I haven't read Patrick Rothfuss, but I've tried. Gosh, what's that fantasy series that inspired George R. R. Martin? Sort of. I don't know if you've read it.
There was a bunch of influences, but he said
There's
like
a
the
bunch, yeah,
Dying
yeah.
Earth. Jack Vance was one,
Jack Vance, yeah. I
and
read a
then
bit of
also
Jack Vance.
yeah. So I mean, that was one of these. Oh, Tad Williams.
Yes, that's who I'm
Yes,
thinking of. Yeah, Tad
Tad Williams,
Williams.
Dragon
Yeah,
Boat
yeah.
Chair. Yes, and I have read a fair
Yes,
amount of Tad
that's right.
Williams.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I liked that first book, but I never sort of I didn't really continue reading it, and I've not read any Brandon Sanderson. I know he seems to be the wonderkind of fantasy as a kind of genre these days. But yeah, I've not stepped in there or into that tent. So I don't know. For some reason, I've sort of developed an interest in Tolkien, but um, it's never really gone beyond that.
Yeah.
And if I'm reading fiction, I sort of read. I don't know what's the last novel I read was something by, oh god, I don't know, probably Steinbeck or something. So something completely different. So I don't know. Yeah, my reading habits are pretty weird, I think, as well. Well, not that yours are weird, but you know what I mean. They're not necessarily
Unique. I like to think unique,
yeah,
special.
unique. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, special. They're special habits. Um, so I'm coming to Tolkien with an interest in him as a writer and in that work, and not necessarily from the perspective of someone who's interested in the fantasy genre as a whole. And we can sort of talk about how Tolkien really fits into that genre, if he does really in a modern sense. But I kind of have doubts about that. I think fantasy's gone in different directions. But again, you've read more of it than me, so I'm not sure I'm the best person to necessarily um, make judgments with regards to that. But it's an interesting side question, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so let's talk about let's talk about the Amazon series, which has kind of been
Sure.
delayed by coronavirus 19 as we're recording right now. Which
Yeah.
unfortunately, I think that is going to be a relevant reference for a long time for the listeners. So
Yes. Yeah.
we're not really dating ourselves, but so that has delayed it, but it looks like it's going to take off again at some point. I mean, maybe they're just going to have to film in South Korea or New Zealand. Actually, it is in New Zealand, isn't it? I don't know if if the Amazon series is also filmed in New Zealand, because that might have helped. But in any case, it's coming back, and so one of the things that people have mentioned, and I joked about this on my blog like a couple of years ago when Word first came out, that they were going to try to update it, make it more contemporary, and introduce some sex scenes. And I was actually just joking. I wasn't super serious,
Right.
because I thought, come now, like there's going to be limits to like how farcical you can make this sort of thing, because it's just, I mean, can you imagine? I don't even know. I don't even know. Like there was apparently, I read in doing a little bit of research for this podcast. Actually, I read that there was a Hollywood treatment of the Fellowship of the Ring,
Yes. Yeah.
where like Frodo was involved in a sex scene.
Yeah. I think with Galadriel, right? Is that what it was?
Yeah,
I
which
think I've
is
read about that somewhere.
that's actually very 2020. That's actually very Rule 34. Like
Yes. Yeah.
I feel that now. Like that is of the time. It is not of the 1980s. It's more of like the 2020s. And so
True.
I guess my point there though is okay, so they have confirmed that they are gonna do some more adult situations. And
Mhm.
my reaction to that is I'm not even outraged. I just laugh, because I just think it's so not in keeping with the spirit and the flavor, just like what you get out
Yeah.
of the books. Like what is the air, the atmosphere in the books like? They're not. Yes, obviously they do have to engage in sexual intercourse somewhere, but that's all off stage. The language
Yeah.
language is very elevated. There's very few like low class people. Like the hobbits are your stand-in for average people, middle class people,
Mm-hmm.
right? Everybody else is, you know, the prince of this, the lord of that, the dwarf prince, and all of them, right?
Yep.
And so
Yeah.
having sex seems a little weird. What do you think?
Well, yeah. So first of all, I want to caution that this story is not well supported by sources. So uh, I believe it was first. Um, I think that the site called OneRing.net, which is sort of a
Yeah.
kind of an older fan site, broke this, but I just want to caution, listeners and also, us that that this is not necessarily going to be well supported by sources. So I wouldn't be surprised if this turns out to be something of a red herring in the end. But let's say that that's right, and there is some sort of sexual element. And by the way, I think just from having a look at a couple of articles online, I think people are sort of concerned that it will become something like the sexploitation kind of phenomenon that seemed to well, it would seem to be prevalent in sort of seasons 1 and 2 of Game of Thrones, especially. And somewhat the later seasons seem to have less of that, but I think that's what people are concerned about. That they don't want necessarily a Littlefinger, standing in front of a whorehouse, as it were.
There's a reason they called him Littlefinger. No, so I'm actually checking One Ring, and so I guess the issue is there was a casting call, and it said you must be comfortable with nudity, and so that doesn't mean that there will be nudity, but maybe they're just making sure that they have that in there. Or what? It could just be a generic casting call that they didn't edit appropriately because whatever.
That's right. Yeah. My understanding is that my understanding is that there's no reason to believe that that's for the Lord of the Rings show. That it could be for some other show. So although apparently they did hire an intimacy coordinator, but again, this is sort of a post-Me Too thing that a lot of shows have. It doesn't necessarily imply sex, let alone sexploitation.
Well, so let me put this out there. I do think if there is nudity, I think that could actually be done tastefully in a way. I don't want to see. I'm just going to put this out there. I don't want to see nude dwarf females. Okay, I don't want to see bearded females nude. I'm just going to say that. Okay,
right.
So I think I have my limits there, but I do think that you could imagine, a tastefully done nude scene or something where it's not even sexual, like maybe they're taking a bath somewhere. I don't know. I'm just trying to say that there's ways that you can do this where it's kind of in keeping with Tolkien's almost Edwardian sensibility. These like tastefully done paintings of nude young women or nymphs or whatever. Okay, I can see that actually. But to like get it on with sex, sex position as they called it on Game of Thrones, that would just be like, what? I mean, so in the world of Middle Earth, you presume that there are sex workers, okay, like prostitutes, right? Because that's what most sex were. There weren't probably strippers in the Middle Ages, so I guess we'll just say prostitutes, right? But they're never depicted. They're never alluded to. That's just not part of the atmosphere of the world that we are exposed to. So even if it's there, we're not told of it. So I think that's what people need to keep in mind if they want to stay true to the original vision, which we don't know if they do. They want to make money, really.
Well, that's true. So I guess I want to say a couple of things. So first of all, there's a difference, I think, between the Lord of the Rings book as a kind of finished and published product, and also some of the other writings. Especially in Unfinished Tales and other volumes that we might look at in the future. And actually, the first kind of story I wanted to look at, more in depth in this podcast, is from Unfinished Tales. That's the story of Aldarion and Arendis, which is set in the sort of Numenor, which is this kind of Atlantis-like island. Which you may remember from Unfinished Tales. But it seems like this is going to feature fairly heavily in the show because it was on one of the maps that was released back in March last year, which sort of revealed the actual setting of the show, that it would be set in the Second Age. And for those listeners who have read Unfinished Tales and sort of even just Lord of the Rings, you'll know that Numenor is a particularly important sort of location, I guess, setting for those stories. And I mean, some of these stories are fragmentary, but particularly this story, it sort of it's about a kind of basically a marital relationship that goes wrong, which ironically sounds very kind of realist fiction like, but it's set in this fantastical world, and it does involve. Although it's true to say, I think that there are no sort of explicit depictions of, say, a sex scene in Tolkien's work. If you read, for example, Eldarion and Arendis, it's much more explicit than Lord of the Rings. It's much more, there are allusions to sex, and there's even kind of an orgy at the end, which is very weird. I think looking only at the Lord of the Rings novel
Yeah,
itself is a
fair.
little, it's understandable because this is the most famous work. But if we're looking at the Second Age, which is what's being actually depicted on the screen, I think there is precedence for more depiction of sexuality, even within the context of Tolkien's own work.
Uh-huh.
I don't know. From my point of view, I think that the Lord of the Rings novel, at any rate, is and again, I think that this is a matter of taste, but I think the Lord of the Rings novel is just it's more it is about kind of male relationships, non-homosexual ones. Well, that's debatable. But
Yeah. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, let's that's actually a good point. So the show is going to be set in the Second Age, which is a little bit of a it's like a little bit of a lacune. I mean, yes, there's
yeah,
stuff that we know about, but Tolkien
yeah,
didn't really focus that much on it. He focused on the First Age and the Silmarillion, a lot of not all of the Unfinished Tales, but there's a lot of those works, like the story of Turin
mm-hmm.
and all that. That's all from the
Mm-hmm.
First Age. A lot happened in the First Age, and
Yeah,
then the Third Age is what Lord of the Rings is. At least, like
yeah,
a lot of the Third Age, and um, then we got the Second Age, which is kind of just backdrop. We don't really have much from it. Like that was the time of
mm-hmm.
Gil-galad, the last of the High King of the Noldor in Middle Earth. So there was a lot of stuff that happened, and
Correct. Yep.
Sauron was, wreaking havoc. So there's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of stuff that happened, but it's all history and it's all really vague. And you do point out an interesting aspect. The Numenorians are very, very. There are people where there's multiple shades of gray there that are not
Mm-hmm.
present in some, like the good elves that we know of from the Lord of the Ring. The Numenorians, they had the elf friends. They had kind of a good faction, but they had an evil faction that led to the Black Numenorians, which refers to kind of like their morals and their ethics, not their complexion. And
No,
so
yeah,
I think that could introduce a sort of dramatic tension that
yeah,
wasn't frankly
yeah.
present in the Lord of the Rings, the film, or in the books, because um, there wasn't any secret good orc, or
Yeah, yeah.
there were not. I mean, I guess Saruman turned, but I mean,
Yeah. I would
characters
want
were
to.
good or
Yeah,
evil.
yeah. I mean, I would want to. I think that's a difficult question. I mean, I would want to first sequester off the question of orcs and sort of ethical questions there, because I think these seem to have developed from a kind of folktale goblin trope, more or less, that and then they're introduced into the early, what would become the Silmarillion material, and but by the time of the Lord of the Rings, they're still kind of there, but they start being used as characters, and in a few of the chapters, and I think for Tolkien, if you read some of the letters, which one day we might get into in more detail, it's clear that he never really resolves the issue of the orcs and what to do with them. And he does, especially in the last couple of volumes of the History of Middle Earth series, he does, sort of communicate a kind of dissatisfaction with how the orcs are dealt with, and ask the question of, can they be redeemed? Are they truly evil? And unfortunately, obviously he passed away and sort of never resolved the question. And I think as readers that's just something that the orcs are just sort of a question that's never quite addressed, perhaps satisfactorily. Um, but I think that's a separate question as to whether the other characters are good or bad, and I think even in the novel, The Lord of the Rings, that's I think part of the problem is that people, when they remember the book or the movies, they think of the big uh, action set pieces, and they forget books like 4 and 6, which deal with Frodo, Sam, and Gollum, which are much more novelistic than the sort of more
Yeah.
romance kind of Aragorn, etc. So I think it's worth remembering that that those that there are those kind of features to the book um, which can give it more of a sort of a novelistic kind of veneer, if you like. but at any rate, yeah, in terms of the Numenoreans, I think that's right. They are a sort of ambiguous kind of culture, and the main story, I guess, that we have of them is, of course, their sort of the downfall, which is in the Silmarillion, which is the second to last story there. But yeah, there's a bit more material in Unfinished Tales, and we do have this kind of partially finished story of sort of the earlier centuries of the kingdom or of the realm, which is quite interesting, and as I said, is something I want to sort of have a look at in more depth. But yeah, I don't know. It's in terms of the show, I don't know exactly what I don't know where they're going to take it, but I hope they look at some of that extra material and sort of incorporate it. Yeah.
One thing I do have to say about the show is the difference between Game of Thrones, the show, and this show is that the world of Tolkien was to some extent already, even before the films, it was already a cultural phenomenon that had kind of broken out of its ghetto.
Yeah.
And, the films really expanded that to the point where, Lord of the Rings is a pop culture phenomenon and touchstone, even for non-nerds. And so the show is stepping into this whole landscape with a lot of pre-existent impressions, beliefs, and just priors, right?
Yeah.
Game of Thrones,
Sure.
I had read the books. I special ordered from England Storm of Swords to get it 3 months ahead of time in June of
Nice,
2000.
yeah.
June of 2000. Okay, so
Right.
I
Yeah.
definitely am like super into that. And so when people started talking about Game of Thrones and all these things, I was just like, okay, this is annoying because I was into this back in the day, and now all these normal people are into it, and
Yeah.
they're also kind of changing certain things so that I mean, if you read a book and like what the hair and eye color of a particular character is, and then it's like they change it, and they didn't do it too much, but they did some of it, and they change it in the show, and people who know it from the show will assume it's a certain way, and you get into this. So, but Game of Thrones, the issue is it was bigger than the novels. Like, it made the novels bigger. Like, it made
Yes,
Mark incredibly rich because people went and bought the novels. Lord of the Rings is a totally different situation because, yes, some people will watch the series on Amazon and buy the novels, but really it's nothing compared to the films, which was like, it was a more restricted media environment, and the films were a huge multi-billion-dollar phenomenon, more than $1 billion. They were huge at the time. And so I think that, we have to keep that in mind. And I think that also places limitations on what they can do because they're not coming into a mental vacuum of what the viewers want. So I think if they do, and I'm not saying that they will, but if they do try to make it too much like Game of Thrones, I think people will be turned off because they already had Game of Thrones. And Lord of the Rings is a totally different thing. And if you lose the core fans, I think that's a problem because you can grow from the core, but you can't abandon the core and get new fans. In my opinion, it's just not going to work as well. Like with word of mouth and positive feedback.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I guess I don't know. Thinking about this, the problem for the show, in my eyes, is that obviously, as we've already said, they're making this a prequel. But as you've already said, the second age material is sort of sparse. It's unfinished. It's not as accessible as obviously the Lord of the Rings novel, let alone the Hobbit. And so, although there is a fan base, a lot, even those fans themselves are not going to be as familiar with the material as as the fans of say Game of Thrones were when the TV series came out. So they're in a sort of an odd position. They've called, well, so far the show is just called Lord of the Rings, so we don't know if it will get a sort of more specific name, or a name more specific to the actual time period that they're setting it in. And at the same time, they at the same time that they're sort of calling it Lord of the Rings, this sort of generic name, which of course will make people think that that this is a new adaptation of the novel. Most of those fans themselves, just don't have much sort of familiarity with that second age material, which is, as we've already sort of talked about it. It's sort of in Unfinished Tales. It's in the History of Middle Earth stuff. It's in a lot of these volumes that I think people just, people might buy it, or but they won't necessarily read every part of it. And unless you're really hardcore sort of Tolkien nerd, like me, you're not necessarily gonna gonna want to read all that stuff, which is fine. So their challenge is to really make a show that somehow appeals to casual kind of fans, like perhaps like you in a sense, and also obviously the core fans, but then also somehow able to draw in more people, and then with Game of Thrones as a kind of context there, the fairly recent past. Gosh, it's starting to sound pretty challenging to me, but maybe they can pull it off. I don't know.
Well, I mean, I hope they can pull it off. You want them to succeed just because it would be interesting to watch.
Yeah.
So I'm definitely pulling for them, but it's gonna be touch and go. It's gonna be tough because the expectations are quite high. I don't think the expectations were really. I'm pretty sure the expectations were not that high for. I mean, there were some expectations for Game of Thrones, but they did not. HBO did not know what it was going to be. Game of Thrones was the biggest show on HBO ever.
Yeah. Right. Okay.
And so they were not expecting that. And so they had a surprise hit on their hands. Well, this Amazon series is not going to be a surprise because it has high expectations, because there were the films that were extremely profitable, and then the books have been going on for more than 50 years now, for 70 years or something, right? So that's just incredible. Whereas, like with Game of Thrones, the series, the Song of Ice and Fire is not even finished yet, so they're not really comparable that way. The show could kind of, steal some thunder from the books in a way, where it's like it could actually be the original source in some ways. That can't be possible with this, even with the fact that it's called Lord of the Rings, but it's set in the Second Age, so it's going to be a little bit different. And then they have like all these other cultural concerns. We haven't really like alluded to this, but I've read of things like, is there going to be diversity on the show? And Tolkien was a man of his time. I think we would call him racist today. I don't think he's definitely not racist at the time, but I mean, some of his views were very. They weren't even Eurocentric; they were Anglocentric in a really deep way. And I don't know how they're going to deal with that. I really don't like people making things politically correct, because what's politically correct now might not be politically correct in 10 years anyway, so what's the point of that? But I do wonder about how they're going to adapt that. Aside from the sex, there's going to be the politics issue. So the honest trailers, it's a YouTube thing, and like they talk about how Lord of the Rings, blah blah blah, all these actors, and and everybody's white. Which is true. Like every single actor in those films, to my knowledge, was white. And I've seen like white nationalist, white identitarian, whatever you want to call it, types online talk about Lord of the Rings, like on Twitter. And one of the great things is like everyone's white. It's like, imagine a world where everyone's white. And so I think they can be a push, and like there were non-white people in the film, because all the evil people, all the people that followed Sauron, were of the non-white races, and so
Yeah,
that's from the book.
yeah, yeah. I suppose again, I think the second age material is a little more ambiguous there, so it perhaps allows for interpretations, visual interpretations that are less strict to, I don't know, to the textual material, which by its nature, as I've already said, is less sort of specific in many regards. Um, the Numenorians themselves, but their colonialism is a big theme. Their imperial sort of overreach, which we'll talk about. And yeah, again, I think a big theme maybe of this podcast will be trying to I don't know, think about Tolkien as an author not only of the Lord of the Rings but also of other texts as well. And some of these are unfinished, but I think they make the world perhaps in some ways more complex than you might take it to be if the Lord of the Rings was only the only text you looked at. But yeah, nevertheless, I mean, in terms of the Lord of the Rings itself, yeah, there are sort of issues there which are obviously perhaps difficult, and yeah, which I think the fandom is sort of more open about now. At least that's my impression. Having having had a look at recent conferences and things, people seem to be talking about those kinds of issues, and it's not a I don't know, it's not really about cancellation or canceling Tolkien or not. It's more about just talking about those issues, I suppose.
Yeah.
At least that's my impression, and trying to come to terms with it, and in the context of
Well, so, there's no question of canceling him, obviously, because he's such a big cultural phenomenon. But
that's right.
bowdlerizing and reshaping the source material, would be. So I don't know how you feel about this. We've been talking for a little while, so we should close out soon. But I want to throw out this like kind of like unscripted topic. I'm very ambivalent about race blind casting when it comes to historicals, because I feel quite often it's distracting, and yes, you do get used to it, but I mean, there's always a limit, there's always a line. Like, you could cast a woman as King Arthur and just say, oh, we're sex blind, we're gender blind, and maybe you get used to it, but so I don't really like it when like on a show like the Vikings or whatever, there's just random Indian and black people, and they're never explained. They're just some of the other Vikings, and I'm just like, okay, that's weird, and you're just kind of making a political point, And so I don't know. I don't want that to happen, because like there were people who are like, as we would say in a Eurocentric frame, of color in the world of Middle Earth, and the Numenorians themselves, with their colonialism, they interacted, they intermarried with them. The Black Numenorians, in particular, I think in Harad, in the in the south of the historic what became Gondor, and so you can work that in a relevant way.
Well, even the Numenorians themselves are not necessarily envisaged to be just completely sort of Northern Europeans. They have the there are various.
Are you talking about the three houses of the Edain?
Yeah, well, there's them. In later sort of essays, Tolkien remarks that some of them are kind of some of them are dark skinned.
Okay.
And there's also the Druidain, who are the sort of the Wozers, and some of them are Numenorians actually.
Yes.
As well.
Yes.
So there's a little bit more. The Numenorians aren't just they're not an Aryan sort of race.
Yeah. I mean, it was of the Numenorians. Like, I think the thing that you're alluding to is just for the listener who is not a total nerd, is so there are three primary houses of elf friends, Edains, that comprise the Numenorians, and it was the House of Beor, the House of Haleth, and the House of Marok, or the House of Hador. So the most numerous, the most numerous were the House of Hador, and they would be like tall blonde types.
Yeah, they're the kind of
yeah, and so those are the most numerous, but the House of Beor is the second, and they are more like brown haired, kind of stockier, and I have read that the House of Beor contributed disproportionately to the ancestor of was it like I forget the name now, but basically the house that led to Elisar, and
Oh, the House of oh God, I think a
yeah,
brain
yeah,
freeze.
you know
Yeah,
what? Yeah, I
yeah.
don't. Yes, but it's
Alinda.
yes, the House of Elendil. Like, but they come from a particular lineage. That's because someone asked
Yeah.
Tolkien that like they're not as blonde as the House of Hador is described in. He said, "Oh well, they have more of their heritage from the House
Yeah,
of
well,
Beor."
he's related to, they come out of Luthien and sort
Yes,
of Baron and yeah,
yes, yes, and Baron was was part of that mix. And then of course there's the House of Heleth, which is like not talked about very much because they spoke a different language, family actually, than the House of Marak and the House of Beor, because they were quite
yeah,
different, and they're kind of like described as small dark people. So those are the three primary and the druid that you were saying were also part of it. So there was a mix, like there is some variation you could draw upon, and
I
so
will say in defense of the House of Heleth that they're pretty important in the story of Turin and various other Silmarillion
yes.
stories.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yeah. So I mean, all of this ethnography is like pretty detailed in Tolkien's Legendary.
Yeah,
There's a lot to
sure.
mine.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think that's interesting. I mean, the ethnography part is perhaps something we can talk about in the future more. But yeah, that's there is quite a detailed schema, I guess, if you like. And there's a scholar called Dimitra Femi who I don't know, you may or may not have heard of. She's she's done a lot of work on that. Be worth sort of having a look at some of her work. But and the sort of the place of that kind of ethnography in a kind of Victorian ideas about race and everything else. So yeah, I think that's an element of Tolkien's work that's interesting and also sort of increasingly talked about in the scholarly community. And as with any adaptation, it'll be interesting to see, how exactly the showrunners incorporate all of that. If at
Yeah.
all, if they pay any attention to it into the
Well,
into the show that's coming up. Yeah.
I do want to say with like the sex and the race and the politics and the gender and the sexual orientation, like there's going to be questions about that. I'm not like a total fuddy duddy. I don't think that we need to be stuck
Yeah.
in 1950, but I also I don't want it to feel like 2020.
Yeah, no, I think I agree with that as well. It shouldn't simply reflect contemporary politics as a kind of like a mirror. It should do something
It
different.
can be inflected. It can be inflected by
Yeah,
contemporary
yeah,
politics because it is this
sure.
of this time and the viewers are of this time. So that makes sense. But the whole idea of this sort of genre fiction, though, this mythic cycle that he created was also to place us in a different time and give us a
Mm.
sense of timeless values, timeless lessons, timeless morals. And part of that has to be that it pulls you out of your time, you know?
Yeah, that's true.
And
Yeah,
so,
yeah,
so for example, like, I'm not white myself, but and I'm pretty conscious of, like I can see like okay, like the bad guys in the war against
yeah.
Mordor, like they look like me. I mean, the humans. I mean, it's just like objectively true. But that doesn't mean that I can't relate as a human being to Aragorn and the side of good and stuff like that. Sometimes you just need to transcend these sort of like
Sure.
petty
Yeah.
identitarian of affiliations, afflictions. Like there's some people who have complained that they don't read Lord of the Rings because it's about white people, and I'm just like, you know what? Like white people, like that's something that's invented in the last couple of centuries.
Right.
There are
Yeah.
no
Yeah.
white people on Middle Earth. Yes, some of them look European, but you're
Yeah.
injecting something into there that doesn't exist there.
Yeah, for sure. And I think again, the Númenórean context will perhaps make some of that politics a little bit more ambiguous. And I think also the films have made it worse because, as you say, they more or less just employed European-looking people for more or less all the sort of main roles, but also all the sort of secondary background kind of like the extras as well.
Yeah.
On
Well,
the
they're all
inside.
the people from New Zealand.
Well, yeah, that's right. And there's all sorts of politics there as well, which is which we won't get into now with regard to New Zealand itself. But I think it's worth mentioning, like in the books, at least some of the Gondorians are not meant to be white. They're meant to be, um, swarthy, as the word as he said. And so it's in the book there is a little, it's a little bit more ambiguous than the movies would suggest. But yeah, I mean, in general, I agree with you. There are sort of difficulties there. But I guess we'll see. Hopefully next year, I guess maybe if they release it then, how that all kind of turns out.
Yeah, I mean, I'm optimistic and I'm hopeful, and hopefully, by then we'll have some more episodes, and this podcast will be part of a broader, conversation.
Well, this will be the best podcast, and we'll have the most listeners. So,
you know what? You know what? Like, just you got to have hope even in the dark times. When, when you think like all hope is lost, it's not lost, and maybe we will be the greatest podcast of them all.
Yeah. So I guess just to finish up here, I just wanted to ask you, because you're the fantasy fan. Talking about adaptations, are there any series that you've read that you would like to see kind of adapted in the future to television, or and I know there's a few that are being adapted.
Yes,
not just obviously the Second Age, Lord of the Rings, but also there's a Game of Thrones prequel, at least one.
Yeah,
and there's Patrick Rothfuss. I think that series is going to be adapted, right? I don't even know.
Yeah, the issue with a lot of these is like a lot of them are in development or option, and they don't ever get made.
Mm-hmm.
So like back when Terry Brooks was a bigger deal, I think they actually did end up making a series on MTV or somewhere of his series. In terms of like what I would like to be made, so I read Brandon Sanderson. Brandon Sanderson is like how would I describe him? He's kind of like a cheese pizza. Where it's like it's delicious, you know what you're gonna get, but you never think back to that. Wow, that cheese pizza I ate 3 months ago. Like I'm still remembering how it tastes. Like no, it's a cheese pizza. You eat it, it's done, and you go on and your thing. So Brandon Sanderson writes books that you can read fast and they're well written and they're enjoyable, but then you don't really. He doesn't leave you with haunting passages or just like scenes that stay with you. So I still remember reading pretty much the prologue of Game of Thrones, the first book in A Song of Ice and Fire, when Ned has to execute the deserter, right? I remember things like that. A lot of people remember the Red Wedding, I just remember where they were when they read it and how they felt. So, for all the negatives and like frankly I think the series has declined a lot since Storm of Swords of George R. R. Martin. He did create some evocative passages and some plot lines. Someone like Ursula K. Le Guin, she was really great prose stylist, and there are passages you can remember. So I'm just contrasting that to say Brandon Sanderson, who he's a really good plotter, but he writes fast, he writes a lot, and it shows because he's not as careful about that sort of thing, and so you don't remember it as well. But I do think it would be good. Some of his stuff, especially the currently unfinished Stormlight Chronicles, this like epic fantasy and like a multi-planetary scale with alien creatures that are very distant. I think it would actually be good as television, because or a film, but definitely television, because it just has all these like world building elements that are unique and novel, and frankly could be some cinematic potential in the way he created this world that's like ripped to shreds periodically by these massive storms and stuff like that. So I think that's one thing that I would say you could turn that. I mean, I think Patrick Rothfuss, his world building, in my opinion, is not as exceptional as George R. R. Martin or Brandon Sanderson. but he has good plot and he has good character, and so I can see how that would be turned into a television show, less a movie. Like I think
Yeah,
movie and
for
a
sure.
film, like so for example, the dragons in Game of Thrones. I mean, the fact that he had
Mhm.
dragons was good for the show
Yeah,
because
right.
like
Yeah,
yes, it was expensive, but like you could do things with the visual medium, you know.
yeah, for sure. Yeah,
Whereas like some other novels don't have dragons, or there's less spectacle, there's more introspection, so maybe it's better fiction, but it might not be as
yeah,
good television.
yeah. Speaking about dragons, my favorite Tolkien book is actually the Children of Hurin, which has a dragon as a
Yeah.
sort of a main character.
Well,
So, um, and speaking
so
about sex, yeah, go on. Sorry.
obscure fact though, all the dragons killed in the history of Middle Earth killed by men.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, that's just a fact. The elves did not kill
Yeah,
any of them.
even Scutha the worm. Yeah, right. Yeah, I guess you mentioned the start of the podcast. You mentioned Scott Baker or Scott Baker.
Yeah, yeah,
I don't
yeah,
know.
yeah,
I've read like two or three of his books. I don't know if you've read them, but I've actually thought it would be fun to adapt his
yeah. His
like
he's
nihilist kind of fantasy.
Yeah, it is nihilist. Like I've read the whole. I read his whole series
Right.
actually.
Okay. Yeah.
I
Yep.
read like is it like two trilogies now, or there's a
Yeah. There's well, at
tetralogy and
least
a
two. Yeah.
trilogy,
Yeah.
and so I've read it all. He's really good in my opinion. I think like he needs to. He's gotten a. I mean, entirely frank. I feel like his last couple of books have been a little stale. Like he hasn't
Right.
really
Okay.
moved the needle too. But again, he has some very evocative. Like for example, the antagonist, the evil, the
Mm,
side of
mm.
evil. In his work is very very like it stays with you. The
Yeah. For
Inkuroi,
sure.
they're
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
extremely like they're literally perverted. They're literally
Yes.
perverted,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And so
Yep.
he has some really great like imagine like
Mm.
the great ship, their great ship that's like buried. Like imagine the scenes that could
Yep.
be filmed there. So people
Yeah.
who
Yeah.
read R. Scott Baker's series know exactly what I'm talking about. So there's a lot of
Sure.
filming,
Yep.
there's a lot of like visual possibilities there
Mm-hmm.
that I think
Mm-hmm.
could be done. So I think that's a good point too.
Yeah. No, I think of any sort of modern fantasy writer that I've read, I think Scott Baker would be my favorite, and I really should get back to reading his stuff because I did read.
So
Yeah.
I actually occasionally I will post about fantasy on my
Yeah.
blog, and he actually left a comment because I mentioned his work in part of my analysis, and he left a comment like, and he actually liked my post. So that was
Right. Oh, nice.
yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
know. I did read a few of his. I think he has a blog. I don't know if it's
Yeah,
still
he
around,
does.
but
3 Pound Brain. I think he's still doing.
yeah,
Like, he's a philosopher by background, so it's
yeah. He
very
writes
very
about philosopher and yeah,
yeah,
yep.
it's very
Um,
dense.
yeah, yeah. It
Very dense.
is.
I
Yeah.
mean, I should speak. Anyone who's read my blog, I should speak about being dense. But
No, that's all right. Yeah, I mean, yeah. No, his blog is particularly intense. Yeah. Well, thank you. I guess we should finish up, but so thanks, Razib, for an interesting discussion about the show, and as that as we find out more about that and as information is released, no doubt we'll talk about that some more. But I guess at the moment, at the time of recording, that sort of represents some of our thoughts. Just a few quick notes before I finish up. Um, I do have a Patreon account if anyone is interested, if anyone is listening. So that's just patreon.com/reading Tolkien pod, pod. Um, and yeah, that's all really. We have I did set up a Twitter page if anyone is interested, so you can follow follow us there. Got a nice logo and everything, so I was particularly happy with that. And yeah, next time hopefully we'll have a look at Eldarion and Arendis, which I sort of mentioned briefly here, from the Unfinished Tales volume. If people are sort of interested in reading that. So thanks again, and we'll yeah, hopefully we'll see you next time. So thanks, Radeep.
all right.
All right, no worries.